Hello, this is Historical Fiction with Kviatoslav, and I would like to discuss today one of my recent purchases and reads, or actually reread, because this is a series that I read in my youth, probably in my early 20s there, and I recently had a chance to reread at least part of the series. And this is one that is an interesting one because this one falls into the category that I would consider historical fantasy. I made a video previously about historical fantasy, and historical fantasy is when you have uh, a setting in kind of basically our world, our history there, but there's some type of fantastical element about it there. So, for example, in The Broken Sword, my favorite historical fantasy book, you've got the actual kind of Viking age, but behind the scenes, there's this kind of war between the trolls and the elves who are invisible to humans and don't really affect the course of history. Um, and this is another example of that. This is a series from the 1980s called The Hound and the Falcon trilogy. And this is actually the second book from the series called The Golden Horn. And I recently had a chance to pick this one up. As you can see, that's a really fantastically beautiful cover. That's really amazing there. I don't know if you can quite see it there, but you've got these two characters on the ledge here, and I think that's intended to be Constantinople there. You can see the Hagia Sophia in the distance there. So it's really, yeah, fantastic piece of cover art there. Um, and yeah, just to go into a little bit of background about the series, this one I think it's I say a prime example of historical fantasy because I think it fits the genre elements really well. In that it's set in a very recognizable world, basically our world, or very similar to our world, in which historical events unfold, in which in the same manner in which they have which they unfolded in our own history. But there is kind of a small kind of fantastical or magical element in the background there, but it doesn't affect the overall history there. It's the kind of thing that if these characters existed, these kind of magical creatures existed, we wouldn't know about them still. So, so in that way, it could actually have been something that happened, like any good historical fiction, an event, a retelling of a way that could have happened, just with you have to get the suspension of disbelief that there were, in this case, these kind of magical elf creatures who were on the fringes of human society there. So the story itself is set around the time of the Crusades. In fact, the Crusades provide the background. The first novel is set during the Third Crusade, the one with Richard the Lionheart. And historical characters do make appearances. Richard features in the first book, along with the main character, the protagonist here, who's a character called Alf, and or Alfred. And Alfred is essentially, he was a foundling. Oh, the first novel is called Isle of Glass, by the way. And he was a foundling who grew up in a monastery um, in Britain there, and but he was actually of a kind of ancient elvish race there, so he never tended to age, but he did grow up in kind of human society. So basically, the book itself kind of tells about him being forced out of the monastery and having to kind of navigate through human life, through human society, but with always the sense that he is a bit different there. He looks human, but he it looks very youthful, like a young boy, even though he's at least 50 years old in terms of these kind of ageless people there. And like I said, I really actually enjoy this one because I think any lover of historical fiction would like this novel because the history is the main part. The the fantasy elements are a bit more in the background. They are there. They're in the background there, but I'm not sure if a fantasy reader would like it as much as a historical fiction reader, because the history is much more prevalent there. But this one actually tells the story of the Fourth Crusade, which is one that I mentioned in my um, nonfiction video there, which is kind of the very odd crusade, the very tragic crusade, where the Western Crusaders, the Latins, went on to sack the Orthodox Christian city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire there. So it's kind of one of the greatest tragedies of Christendom against Christendom during the Crusades there. And this one, I remember this because this was actually my introduction to the Fourth Crusade there. Where actually, they don't give a great deal of the politics behind it, but you get a general sense of the events, the way they're going, and the kind of the terrible tragedy. Alf, the main character here, he's returning from Jerusalem after his pilgrimage during the Third Crusade, and gets injured, basically gets sunstroke, and gets kind of rescued by this kind of patrician Greek family from Constantinople, and they take him in, and he becomes the educator of their children, and basically becomes a member of their family there. So then the tragedy of the Fourth Crusade is kind of told through his interactions with this peaceful Greek family there. And I said I think it's really nice, good read there. I think it's a good depiction of the Fourth Crusade, and I said it is, obviously it ends, spoilers, it ends in terrible tragedy there, but you can really get a sense of the events that were taking place there. So this is the second book. This is actually my favorite. I've read all three of the books. I had them all in one volume back in my youth there, the Isle of Glass, Golden Horn, and Hounds of God. But this one is always the one that I remember, that really stood out to me, particularly because it's that introduced me to the Fourth Crusade there. So I would recommend to the whole series there. I think it's quite good. If you're a fan of fantasy, I think you can enjoy it. And if you're a fan of historical fiction, I think you can enjoy the series as well, as long as you're, as long as you allow, some fantastical elements into your reading there. It's still quite a good, a well-written story and an entertaining story. So recommend there for the series The Hound and the Falcon by Judith Tarr. Thanks for listening. Bye.